My name is Tyler. I'm 38 years old, and I've worked as an electrician for a power company in central Kentucky for nearly 12 years. I live in a small town near Bowling Green, so I'm used to responding to service calls in rural areas where you can drive 40 or 50 minutes without seeing more than a handful of people. Most of the work is routine, even when it happens during storms. You get used to dealing with rain, wind, mud, and dirt roads. On the night this happened, I was on call because a powerful storm system had moved through the region, bringing down tree limbs and causing multiple power outages. It was close to 11 o'clock at night when the dispatcher informed me that a transformer was experiencing fluctuations on a rural road used almost exclusively by farms. It wasn't an emergency that put residents in immediate danger, so they sent only one service truck. I went alone, just as I did on most of those calls. Before leaving the operations center, I checked my equipment, put on my rain gear, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out, thinking only about finishing the job as quickly as possible and getting home before sunrise. The farther I drove, the worse the weather became. The rain hit the windshield so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. The wind rocked the truck on some of the more open stretches of road, and small branches were scattered across the pavement. When I finally reached the transformer listed in the service call, I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and got out. The rain was freezing, running down inside the collar of my rain jacket despite everything being zipped up tightly. There was no light except for the truck's headlights and the occasional flashes of lightning that, for a few seconds, made the entire road look like daylight, before everything disappeared back into darkness. The transformer stood beside a wooden fence enclosing a large empty pasture. There weren't any houses visible from where I was, just trees, utility poles, and the road disappearing in both directions. I picked up my two-way radio to stay in contact with dispatch while beginning the inspection. It was standard procedure, especially since cell service in that area almost never worked during severe storms. At that moment, I had absolutely no reason to imagine that anyone other than members of the utility company would show up there at that hour of the night. I started by checking the power lines and insulators using the flashlight mounted on my hard hat. The wind constantly shook the beam, and the rain striking my face shield made it difficult to see any details. Every so often I had to stop working, just to wipe the water from my eyes with the sleeve of my rain jacket. That's when the truck's radio, which I'd left on to monitor any updates from dispatch, crackled with the familiar burst of static interference. I assumed the dispatcher was trying to reach me, so I walked back to the driver's door to turn up the volume. Instead of hearing his voice, I heard heavy breathing for several seconds, followed by a man speaking in a hurried tone. He was saying something like, "If anyone can hear this, please help me. I'm stuck on the road. There's a transformer right in front of me." I froze completely. I kept listening. The voice sounded nervous, like someone trying to keep panic under control. Then he said something else that made my stomach turn cold. He mentioned there was a wooden fence beside the road and a white utility truck parked with its lights on. I immediately looked at my truck. It was white. The headlights were indeed on. That description matched exactly where I was parked. My first thought was that another vehicle must be hidden somewhere farther down the road, beyond the reach of my headlights. I grabbed my more powerful flashlight, got back into the truck, and slowly drove both directions along the road for several minutes. I found absolutely nothing. The road remained straight for quite a distance, and although the rain was heavy, it wasn't nearly enough to hide an entire vehicle. There were no headlights, no running engine, no hazard lights, and no signs of an accident. I also checked the shoulders and the entrances to nearby farms. Everything was deserted. While trying to come up with a logical explanation, the radio crackled to life again all by itself. The same voice returned, but this time it was much quieter, almost a whisper. It said, "He's still here. Don't let him get close to the truck." Before I could answer, the transmission was swallowed by a loud, continuous burst of static, as though someone had pressed the microphone without saying a word. I stared at the radio for several seconds, unsure what to do. I considered the possibility that the lightning was causing interference, but that still didn't explain how someone knew so many exact details about where I was, especially on a completely deserted road just before midnight. I stood there for a few moments trying to decide whether I should head back to the operations center or finish the repair. I'd dealt with strange radio interference during storms before, so I tried convincing myself there had to be some technical explanation. I picked up my tools again and walked back toward the transformer, but the feeling of being alone had completely disappeared. Every few seconds, I turned and swept my flashlight down the road behind me. The wind made the vegetation sway constantly, producing the endless sound of leaves and branches scraping together. There were no footsteps, voices, or engines. Even so, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. A few minutes later, I remembered a tool I'd left inside the truck. As soon as I reached the vehicle, I noticed something strange. The passenger door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it before beginning the inspection. At first, I blamed the wind, but when I opened the door, I caught the strong smell of wet soil mixed with damp leather. The interior light came on, revealing fresh, muddy boot prints scattered across the passenger seat and floorboard. They were large, well-defined boot prints, as though someone had climbed inside, sat there for a few moments, and then gotten back out. The mud was still glistening from the rain. Those prints hadn't been there when I arrived. My heart immediately started racing. The first thing I did was grab my flashlight and shine it around the ground beside the truck, hoping to find footprints showing where that person had gone. To my surprise, the rain had already washed almost everything away. The gravel was soaked, and only a few faint impressions remained near the passenger door before disappearing a few yards away. I shouted, asking if anyone was there, and warned that I'd call the police if they didn't come out. No one answered. The only sounds were the rain pounding against the truck and the constant hum of the power lines overhead. I quickly shut the door, locked the truck, and picked up my radio to inform dispatch that someone might be in the area. Before I even had a chance to speak, an incredibly bright flash of lightning illuminated the entire road for a split second. Instinctively, I looked toward the transformer. In that brief flash, I clearly saw the silhouette of a man standing just a few yards from the structure. He stood perfectly still, facing me, with his arms hanging at his sides. He didn't appear to be seeking shelter from the rain or reacting to the storm in any way. When darkness returned, he vanished from sight. And for the first time in many years on the job, I felt such intense fear that I seriously considered abandoning the repair and driving away without looking back. I kept staring at the spot where I'd seen the man, waiting for the next lightning strike. My mind searched desperately for a simple explanation. Maybe he was a farmer worried about the power outage. Maybe someone had stopped to ask for help and I'd misinterpreted everything because of the stress and the weather. But none of those explanations made sense. If he lived nearby, why would he simply stand there watching me instead of speaking? I waited through several seconds that felt much longer. When another flash of lightning lit up the road, he was still there, almost exactly where he'd been before. This time I noticed something that unsettled me even more. He wasn't carrying a flashlight, wasn't wearing a raincoat, and had no umbrella. He stood completely exposed to the storm, simply watching me. I raised my flashlight and pointed it directly toward him, but the beam couldn't cut clearly through the curtain of rain at that distance. Even so, I shouted, asking if he needed help. There was no answer, not even the slightest movement. I decided not to approach him. Instead, I climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and switched on the high beams. When the light flooded the area around the transformer, the man was gone. I quickly looked both directions down the road. There was no way anyone could have run that far in only a few seconds without me noticing. At that point, I finally reached dispatch over the radio. I explained that someone had entered my truck and that I'd seen a man standing near the transformer. The operator remained silent for several seconds before asking whether I felt safe staying where I was. I told him I didn't. He instructed me to get inside the truck, keep the doors locked, and wait for a sheriff's deputy, since one was already responding to another call about 20 minutes away. While I waited, I kept the headlights aimed down the road and watched everything around me without taking my eyes off the darkness. I didn't shut off the engine for even a second. A few minutes later, the radio crackled by itself again. I assumed it was dispatch, but it was the same male voice. This time he spoke so quietly it almost sounded as though he were sitting beside me. He said only one sentence: "Don't get out of the truck." Then the transmission ended with a sharp burst of static. At that exact moment, I heard a sound coming from the rear of the vehicle, as though someone had placed both hands on the truck bed. It wasn't a loud impact. It sounded more like the weight of someone slowly leaning against the tailgate. I froze, staring only into the rearview mirror, unable to see anything except rain streaming down the back window. I remained perfectly still for several seconds, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my hands began to ache. I wanted to turn and look through the rear window, but I was afraid of seeing someone pressed against the glass. The noise from the truck bed happened 2 more times, always slowly, as though someone were shifting their weight from one side to the other. Then everything became completely silent. Even the wind no longer seemed as strong. A few minutes later, I finally saw the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car approaching in the distance. I had never been so relieved to see a police vehicle. As soon as the deputy parked behind my truck, I got out quickly and told him everything that had happened. Together, we searched around the transformer, examined the road, the fence, and even walked partway through the pasture with powerful flashlights. We found no one. The deputy also looked inside the truck and saw the muddy boot prints on the passenger seat. He asked whether I'd transported anyone earlier that night. I told him I hadn't. The prints were fresh and still wet. We also checked the truck bed, hoping to find footprints or handprints, but the rain had washed away almost every trace. The transformer repair was assigned to another crew the following morning because the deputy didn't want me staying there by myself. The next day, I was called into the office to complete an incident report. The company took the situation seriously because abandoning a service call was something I simply never did. A few days later, I learned that the sheriff's office had searched the area trying to locate any missing driver or anyone who might have made the radio transmission asking for help. They found no matching reports. There were also no reports of accidents anywhere along that road during the entire storm. What has stayed with me the most is the fact that the voice knew exactly where I was before I even realized anyone else was nearby. I never found out who got into my truck, who the man standing beside the transformer was, or who spoke to me over the radio. I still work for the power company today, but there's one personal rule I've never broken since that night. If I receive a service call on an isolated road in the middle of the night and have to respond alone, I keep every door locked at all times, even when I'm only a few feet away from the truck. It may sound excessive to someone who has never experienced something like that. To me, it's simply the only thing I know how to do after that night. Story 2. My name is Mia. I'm 21 years old, and at the time this happened, I was in my 3rd year of nursing school at a small university in rural Indiana. I lived in an apartment with another student, but it wasn't exactly close to campus. Since I didn't have my car during the week, I usually took the city bus to and from class. My father lived in a town about 40 minutes away, and on weekends I left my car parked at my aunt's house, which was much closer to the university. That Thursday, I planned to do exactly that. After my last evening class, I was going to take the bus to my aunt's house, pick up my car, and drive back to my apartment. It seemed like a completely ordinary plan. The problem was that a storm rolled in just as class ended. The professor had to stop his presentation several times because the thunder was so loud, and by the time we left the building, it was pouring rain. I thought I'd still have enough time to reach the bus stop, but I ended up spending a few extra minutes talking with a classmate about a project. When I turned the corner, I saw the taillights of the last bus of the night disappearing down the avenue. I ran after it for a few yards, even though I knew it was pointless, but it was already far too gone. At that hour, almost the entire campus was empty. Most of the students had left before the storm got worse or had their own cars to get home. My phone showed that requesting a rideshare would be difficult because there were almost no drivers available in the area during storms like that. On top of that, the fare was much higher than usual. I decided to wait for a while in a bus shelter located near the edge of the university town, close to a state highway. It was one of those simple shelters with a metal roof, 2 glass walls, and a concrete bench. Behind it was nothing but an empty lot and a few trees. In front, the highway stretched for miles toward the next town. The rain was falling so heavily that it formed a curtain, making it impossible to see more than a few dozen yards ahead. The streetlights illuminated only small sections of the shoulder, and the lightning was the only thing that truly lit up the entire area for a few seconds at a time. I knew my car was parked at my aunt's house, only about 4 blocks away, but walking that distance completely soaked, in strong winds and poor visibility, didn't seem like a good idea. So I sat down on the bench inside the shelter, placed my backpack beside me, and waited for the rain to ease up. I spent some time checking the weather forecast on my phone, but the internet connection kept cutting in and out because of the storm. Sometimes the pages wouldn't even load. I sent my aunt a message telling her I'd come get my car as soon as the rain let up a little, but she was probably already asleep because she never replied. The campus parking lot was almost completely empty, and for about 10 minutes not a single car passed along the highway. The only constant sounds were the rain pounding against the shelter's metal roof, and the wind making the trees sway behind me. I was starting to think about simply running to my car when I heard footsteps approaching along the shoulder of the road. I looked to my right and saw a man walking through the rain. He was wearing a dark hooded jacket, jeans, and carrying a small backpack. When he reached the shelter, he stopped outside for a few seconds, wiped some rainwater from his face with his hand, and asked whether I was also waiting for transportation. His voice was calm and polite. I said yes and explained that I'd missed the last bus. He said he was also trying to get a ride, but that nobody ever stopped on that road during storms like this. It seemed like a perfectly normal conversation, so I didn't think much of it. He stepped into the shelter and leaned against the glass wall on the opposite side from me, leaving enough distance that it actually felt respectful. We barely spoke after that. I looked at my phone every now and then while he remained silent, watching the road. A few minutes later, a flash of lightning illuminated everything around us for an instant. It happened quickly, but I noticed he was no longer leaning against the wall. He was now standing near the end of the bench, a few steps closer to me. I thought it was strange because I hadn't heard him move over the sound of the rain. I tried to ignore it. I figured he had simply walked over while I was looking at my phone. I went back to the screen, trying once again to request a rideshare. Less than a minute later, another flash of lightning lit up the entire highway. This time, a chill ran through my stomach. The man had changed positions again. Now he was standing directly in front of the bench where I was sitting, close enough to make me uncomfortable. The strangest part was that throughout all of this, I hadn't heard a single footstep. Only the rain, the thunder, and that strange silence between one lightning strike and the next. I looked at him for a few seconds, trying to act as though nothing was wrong. As soon as he noticed I was watching him, he smiled politely and asked if I was okay. I told him I was, even though my heart was already racing. Then I casually mentioned that my boyfriend was on his way to pick me up, even though that wasn't true. I wanted him to think someone would be arriving soon. He simply nodded and looked back toward the road. I picked up my phone again and pretended to send messages, but I was actually trying to call my aunt. The call wouldn't even connect because of the weak signal. While I waited, I listened carefully for any movement from him. Nothing. Only the sound of the rain hammering against the metal roof. Then another flash of lightning illuminated everything for less than a second. Instinctively, I looked up. He was even closer now. There were only 1 or 2 steps separating us. It made no sense. I'd been looking at my phone almost the entire time, and even with the noise of the storm, it was hard to believe someone could walk across a concrete floor without making any sound at all. My stomach tightened and I realized I needed to get out of there before something happened. I stood up, saying I was going to try finding a better place to get a cell signal. The moment I got to my feet, he stood up too. It wasn't a sudden movement, but it was immediate, almost as though he'd been waiting for me to make a decision. Trying to sound calm, I asked whether he lived nearby. He replied only that he was waiting for someone, without saying who. The answer struck me as odd, especially since there weren't any houses nearby and almost no cars traveled that road at that hour. I took a few steps out of the shelter, immediately feeling the cold rain soak through my clothes. I glanced back. He remained beneath the roof but was now completely turned toward me, watching my every movement. At that moment, a car sped past, throwing up a huge wall of water. I used the opportunity, while the headlights illuminated the road, to keep walking without running, trying to appear calm. After about 20 yards, I looked back again. The shelter was empty. My heart immediately started pounding. There was nowhere he could have hidden in that short amount of time. The road was open on both sides, and I would have seen him if he'd started walking in either direction. Yet somehow, he had simply vanished. I kept walking without looking back for several seconds, but the feeling that someone was watching me only grew stronger. My aunt lived just a few blocks away, and I knew the route well. It was a residential street with modest houses, a few trees, and only a handful of streetlights still working because of the storm. Under normal circumstances, The walk would have taken less than 5 minutes. That night, it felt much longer. Rain streamed down my face and I constantly had to wipe my eyes just to see. At one point, a powerful clap of thunder echoed overhead, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire street. Instinctively, I looked back. I saw the same man walking along the sidewalk, maybe 50 yards behind me. He wasn't running or making any gestures. He was simply walking in the same direction. The light disappeared and everything went dark again. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was all just a coincidence. A few seconds later, another flash lit up the street. My stomach turned cold. The distance between us had closed far more than would have been possible if he had only been walking normally. Now he was near the next corner, perhaps 20 yards behind me. I hadn't heard footsteps, breathing, or any sound besides the rain. That was the moment I stopped trying to stay calm. I ran as fast as I could toward my aunt's house. I knew exactly where my car was parked, along the curb in front of her driveway. I pulled the keys from my backpack while I was still running. When I finally reached the car, I immediately felt a chill. The driver's door was slightly open. I was certain I'd locked it the previous weekend because I always checked twice before going inside the house. Yet there it was, open just enough that the interior light remained off. I quickly looked down the street. I couldn't see the man, but I also couldn't see very far through the heavy rain. I slowly pulled the door open, and the first thing I noticed was that the driver's seat was completely soaked. It wasn't just rain that had blown in through the crack in the door. It looked as though someone had been sitting there for quite some time wearing wet clothes. Water had pooled on the seat, and there were small, muddy footprints on the floor mat beside the pedals. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I stood beside the car for several seconds, unable to bring myself to get inside, imagining who might have been sitting there waiting for me to arrive. I took a deep breath, pressed the key fob to lock and unlock the car again, and threw the door open. The first thing I did was shine my phone's flashlight throughout the interior. I checked the back seat, the space behind the front seats, and even the trunk by using the interior release lever. No one was there. Even so, the feeling that I wasn't alone refused to go away. I climbed inside quickly, slammed the door shut, and locked it immediately. Before even starting the engine, I looked into every mirror. The street was still empty. As I tried inserting the key into the ignition, I heard 3 light taps on the passenger side window. They weren't loud, more like someone gently tapping the glass with their fingertips. I turned my head instantly. No one was standing beside the car. I stared at the window for several seconds, waiting for someone to appear, but all I saw was rain running down the glass. I started the engine and drove away without even waiting for the defroster to clear the windshield properly. A few minutes later, as I passed the bus shelter again, I slowed down just enough to glance over. It was empty, exactly as it had been when I'd left. The next day, I told my aunt everything that had happened, and together we went back to the car to see whether one of the doors had been malfunctioning. None of them were. The locking system worked perfectly, and there were no signs of forced entry. I also didn't find anything missing. The only things out of place were the completely soaked driver's seat and the small muddy marks on the floor, which disappeared once I cleaned the car. For several days, I kept wondering whether it had all been nothing more than a series of coincidences. A stranger waiting for a bus, a car door I might have forgotten to lock, and a violent storm confusing my perception. But there's one detail I've never been able to explain. When I reached over to grab my belongings from the passenger seat that same night, I found a crumpled peppermint candy wrapper sitting in the cup holder. I never buy that kind of candy, and my aunt also told me she'd never been inside my car. Maybe it was something insignificant. Maybe it had been there long before and I'd simply never noticed it. Even so, ever since that night, I've never waited alone at a bus stop after dark again. And every time I get into my car, the very first thing I do is check the back seat before closing the door. Story 3. My name is Lauren. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a real estate agent in Eastern Tennessee. Most of the properties I sell are located in small towns and rural areas, so it's common for me to visit vacant homes to check for any issues before buyers or maintenance crews arrive. I always enjoyed that part of the job because it was usually quiet and uneventful. The week this happened, a powerful storm swept through the area overnight, knocking down trees and leaving several neighborhoods without power. Early the next morning, the owner of a house that was listed for sale called me concerned. A neighbor had told him that some branches had fallen onto the property, and he wanted to know whether there was any damage before filing an insurance claim. Since the house was vacant and I had the key, I agreed to stop by late that afternoon to take photos and send him a report. I expected it to be a quick 20 or 30-minute visit. I already knew the house because I'd shown it to several potential buyers over the previous weeks. I'd never had any problems there before. The rain had eased considerably by the time I left the office, but the sky was still very dark, and the forecast called for more storms that night. The house sat at the end of a narrow road surrounded by trees, about 20 minutes from the nearest town. When I arrived, I realized the entire area was still without electricity. None of the nearby houses had lights on, and several utility poles were still out. I parked in the driveway, grabbed my flashlight, my phone, and a folder containing the property's paperwork. The yard was covered with leaves, small branches, and puddles of water. I walked up to the porch, hearing nothing but rain dripping from the trees and the distant rumble of thunder. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me out of habit, especially since it was still fairly windy. The interior of the house was completely dark. Even though it was late afternoon, the clouds were so thick that almost no light came through the windows. I switched on my flashlight and began photographing each room, focused only on finishing the report before the storm returned in full force. I started in the living room, where a few small branches were scattered near the back door, probably blown inside after part of the roof had lost some shingles. I took photos of water leaking through the ceiling, stains running down one wall, and a window that had developed a small crack but remained closed. The house was completely empty with no furniture, which made every sound echo much louder than usual. Even my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the wooden floors. Every now and then I stopped just to listen before moving into the next room. While photographing the kitchen, I heard a loud bang coming from the hallway. It sounded like a door slamming shut. My first thought was that a window had been left open because of the wind. I walked into the hallway and found every door exactly as I'd left it. I opened each one to check the bedrooms and bathroom. Every window was closed and locked. I couldn't feel even the slightest draft. I even tested one of the windows to see whether the wind could move it, but it barely budged. Convinced the noise must have come from outside, I returned to the kitchen and continued taking pictures. Less than a minute later, I heard another slam, this time much closer. The sound came from one of the bedroom doors, followed by complete silence. I stood still, trying to figure out exactly where it had come from. Before I could decide whether to investigate, another door slammed somewhere else in the house. Then another. These weren't doors repeatedly banging from the wind. They happened one at a time, at irregular intervals, as though someone were walking from room to room, closing each door behind them. What unsettled me most was that each sound came from a different direction. I shined my flashlight back down the hallway and slowly walked toward the first bedroom. The door was closed. I'd left it open only seconds earlier. I opened it carefully. The room was still empty. No furniture, no open windows, no sign that anyone had been inside. A chill ran up my arms, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself the doors might have been moving because of the humidity or simply because the house was old. Even so, something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was inside the house with me. I kept telling myself I just needed to finish and leave. I only had a few more pictures to take of the master bedroom and the laundry room. Even so, I started shining my flashlight into every corner before stepping into each room. The house was old but well laid out, with a narrow hallway connecting every bedroom to the living room. While photographing a water stain near the ceiling in the master bedroom, I heard another door slam. This one was so loud that it made the window frame vibrate. I immediately stepped into the hallway. The laundry room door near the back of the house was slowly swinging as though it had just been pushed. I walked toward it, loudly asking if anyone was inside the house. No one answered. I pushed the door fully open and shined my flashlight inside. The room was empty. There wasn't anywhere for someone to hide. As I turned back toward the hallway, I heard another slam behind me. The master bedroom door, which I'd just left open, was now closed. At that moment, I stopped trying to come up with explanations. There was no way I could have been opening and closing that many doors without noticing, and every single window was still locked. It was still raining outside, but the wind had almost completely died down. I decided to end the inspection immediately. I put my phone away, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and headed straight for the front door. I just wanted to leave. When I reached it, I turned the doorknob and pulled. It didn't open. I tried again, this time with more force. Nothing. I thought the lock might have jammed, so I unlocked it with the key from the inside and tried again. The door remained completely stuck. My heart started racing. I stepped back and threw my shoulder against it. It was useless. At that exact moment, a bolt of lightning illuminated the front porch through the narrow window beside the door. In that flash, I clearly saw the silhouette of a man standing outside. He was positioned directly in front of the entrance, one hand gripping the doorknob from the outside. He wasn't trying to force his way in. It looked as though he was simply preventing me from getting out. As soon as darkness returned, I stood frozen, trying to figure out whether I'd really seen him or whether the lightning had played tricks on my eyes. Then I felt the doorknob slowly move in my hand as though someone really was holding it from the other side. My first instinct was to shout, asking who was there. My voice came out much louder than I expected, but I received no response at all. I kept holding the doorknob while trying to pull it again. The resistance from the other side remained exactly the same. It didn't feel like the door was jammed. It felt like someone simply refused to let go. I stepped back and shined my flashlight through the narrow window beside the entrance. Rain streamed down the outside, distorting everything, and I couldn't see anyone. I waited for another flash of lightning. When it came, the silhouette appeared again, almost exactly where it had been before. This time I could tell the man was facing the door, his head slightly lowered. He didn't move at all except for keeping his hand on the doorknob. My phone still had a little signal, so I immediately called 911. While waiting for someone to answer, I heard a sound coming from the porch, like slow footsteps on the wet wood. Then, suddenly, the pressure on the doorknob disappeared. I seized the opportunity and pulled with all my strength. The door opened only a few inches before striking something outside. I shoved harder and managed to open it just enough to squeeze through. I ran straight to my car without looking back. I got inside, locked every door, and started the engine before even putting on my seatbelt. When my headlights illuminated the porch, there was absolutely no one there. Even so, the front door of the house remained standing open exactly as I'd left it when I ran out. I sat there for several minutes waiting for the police to arrive. 2 officers showed up about 15 minutes later and conducted a thorough search of the house and the surrounding property. They found no one, no footprints preserved by the rain, and no signs of forced entry. One of them opened and closed the front door several times without any difficulty. The lock worked perfectly. They also checked every window and confirmed that each one was locked from the inside. To this day, I don't know who was holding that doorknob or why the doors kept slamming throughout the house while I was alone inside. The owner eventually sold the property a few months later, and I never told the buyers what had happened that night. I still work as a real estate agent, but ever since then I've followed one rule that I never break. If I have to inspect a vacant house after a storm, I never go inside alone. Story 4. My name is Nathan. I'm 41 years old, and I work as a sales representative for a company that sells agricultural equipment across several southern states. I live near Jackson, Mississippi, and spend a good part of the week driving between small towns to visit clients. Anyone who does this kind of work gets used to spending hours on secondary roads, often without cell service and without seeing another car for miles. What happened to me took place at the end of the summer, when a tropical storm was moving across the state. I had spent the entire day visiting 2 dealerships in rural areas, and my plan was to get home before the rain got any worse. I left a little later than I had intended because one of my meetings ran longer than expected. Before getting on the road, I checked the weather forecast on my phone. It showed heavy rain throughout the night, but no highways had been officially closed at that point. I figured that if I drove carefully, I would make it home without any problems. It was a mistake that almost cost me dearly. At the beginning of the trip, the rain was still light, but as I drove farther into more remote areas, it became much heavier. The windshield wipers were running at full speed, and even then there were moments when I could barely make out the lane markings. The wind was blowing branches onto the road, and shallow pools of water were beginning to form in the lower sections. I was driving along a narrow state highway surrounded by woods and flooded lowlands, where there were practically no gas stations or houses nearby. Since I knew the area fairly well, I decided to keep going instead of turning back toward the nearest town. About 40 minutes later, I reached a concrete bridge that crossed what was usually a very small creek. That night, however, the water had risen significantly because of the storm. The roadway was still visible, but part of the bridge entrance was covered by a sheet of muddy water slowly flowing across the pavement. I immediately slowed down. That's when I noticed a sedan stopped a few yards ahead with its hazard lights flashing. Standing beside it, a man was frantically waving both arms, signaling for me to stop. I stopped my pickup at a safe distance and kept the engine running. Through the heavy rain, it was difficult to make out many details, but the sedan appeared to be sitting sideways across the road, as though it had lost control while trying to cross the water. The man kept waving desperately. He was wearing a dark raincoat and looked completely soaked. As soon as I rolled my window down a few inches to ask what had happened, he quickly replied that the car had stalled in the middle of the bridge and that another person was trapped inside. His voice sounded urgent, and my first instinct was to believe him. After all, the water really was rising. I looked toward the sedan, trying to see someone in the driver's seat, but the rain and the water-covered windows made it nearly impossible to see inside. I thought about calling emergency services, but my phone had been without signal for several minutes. The man shouted for help again and said that if the water kept rising, the car would be swept away by the current. It sounded like the kind of situation where every second mattered. I switched off my high beam so I wouldn't blind him, grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The moment my feet touched the water, I realized the current was much stronger than it had looked from inside the vehicle. I walked carefully, making sure not to slip on the muddy pavement. The man backed away a few steps toward the sedan, motioning for me to come closer. That's when a bolt of lightning lit up the entire bridge. In that flash, I saw something that had been completely hidden by the darkness before. Beneath the bridge, leaning against the concrete support pillars, were two men. They were standing perfectly still, staring directly at me. As soon as darkness returned, a chill ran through my entire body. I stopped immediately. My mind searched for an explanation, but none of them made sense. If they were there to help with the supposed accident, why were they hiding under the bridge instead of standing near the car? Before I could say anything, both of them slowly started climbing the concrete embankment toward the road while the man beside the sedan kept insisting that I come closer. At that moment, every detail suddenly fell into place. I'd never seen anyone asking for help while backing away instead of running toward the first car that stopped. The sedan was perfectly aligned on the road, with no signs of a collision, no deployed airbags, and no broken windows. I also noticed that its taillights were off. Only the hazard lights were flashing. If someone had really been trapped inside, I probably would have seen some movement or heard someone calling for help. Instead, there was only that man trying to lure me toward the middle of the bridge. I took a step backward without taking my eyes off him. That's when he stopped pretending to be desperate. His expression changed completely. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't look worried anymore either. He simply stood there watching me in silence. At the same time, I heard water rushing behind me. I glanced quickly over my shoulder and saw that the sheet of water covering the road had grown considerably. The current was now strong enough to push small branches as they floated across the pavement. If I waited much longer, I risked becoming trapped between the floodwaters and those three men. I ran back to my pickup. I heard one of them shout something that I couldn't make out over the rain, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps splashing through the water. I jumped into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine immediately. My first instinct was to back up, but at that moment I realized the water had also spread across part of the road behind me. It was still possible to get through, but not for much longer. I shifted into reverse and accelerated carefully to avoid losing traction. In the rearview mirror, I saw all three men running toward me. They weren't trying to hide anything anymore. One of them even raised his arms, signaling for me to stop, while another ran along the side of the bridge trying to cut me off. I kept backing up as fast as the water allowed. As soon as I reached the higher section of the road, I turned the truck around and accelerated without looking back. I didn't stop until I was several miles away, where I finally found cell service and was able to call emergency services in the sheriff's office. I waited for the police at a gas station that was still open on the edge of a nearby town. When the officers arrived, I told them exactly what had happened and showed them the location of the bridge on a map. They listened carefully and said that other roads in the area were already being closed because of the flooding. About an hour later, one of the officers returned and informed me that the water had risen so quickly that the bridge was now completely underwater. They hadn't been able to cross it to check on the sedan that night. The following morning, after the water level had dropped, a team returned to the scene. The car was gone. There was also no record of any abandoned vehicle or accident at that bridge during the entire storm. One of the officers commented that, unfortunately, criminals sometimes take advantage of severe weather because they know many drivers will stop to help when they see someone who appears to be in danger. He said it wasn't possible to confirm that this was exactly what had happened, but he admitted the situation was extremely suspicious. I thought about it for a long time afterward. I've always considered myself the kind of person who would stop to help any stranger in an emergency, and I still believe that most people asking for help on the side of the road genuinely need it. But that night changed the way I respond in situations like that. If I see someone needing assistance in an isolated place, I still call the police or emergency services as soon as I get a signal, but I no longer get out of my vehicle when I'm alone. Sometimes I feel guilty for thinking that way because I know someone could truly need help. At the same time, I remember the expressions on those three men's faces when they realized I had figured out what was happening. They never ran toward me asking for help. They only ran when they realized I was leaving. If I had taken just a few more steps onto that bridge, with the water rising and no one else around, I honestly don't know if I'd be here writing this today. Story 5. My name is Megan. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a nurse at a hospital in the Springfield, Missouri area. A few months ago, my husband was invited to attend a medical conference in Kansas City. Since I was able to take a few days off, we decided to rent a small house in the countryside so we could spend the rest of the week together after the conference ended. The plan was simple. He would spend 2 days at the conference while I relaxed at the house reading, catching up on a few work-related things, and enjoying the quiet, something that's rare when you work long hospital shifts. The house was located in a rural area surrounded by trees and open fields, about 15 minutes from the nearest town. It was beautiful, well-maintained, and looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing ever happens. The afternoon my husband left for the conference, the owner mentioned that severe storms were expected that night, and simply asked me to keep the doors locked because of the strong winds. I didn't think anything of it. Storms were common in that area during that time of year. I spent the rest of the afternoon as usual. I made myself a simple meal, watched a little television, and video called my husband before he went to bed at his hotel. Around 10 that night, the rain began. First came a few distant rumbles of thunder, then the wind picked up considerably and soon the rain was pounding against the windows. The house made the usual small creaking noises typical of wooden buildings shifting with changes in temperature and strong winds, something that had never bothered me. Before going to bed, I checked that all the doors were locked and turned off the lights in the living room. Just as I went upstairs to grab a blanket from the bedroom, I heard the first thud coming from the roof. It was a sharp sound, as if something fairly heavy had landed on the shingles. My immediate reaction was to assume a branch had been torn loose by the wind. I waited a few seconds, but the sound didn't happen again. I continued walking through the house without giving it much thought. A few minutes later, while crossing the hallway toward the kitchen to get a glass of water, I heard the exact same thud again. This time, however, it sounded like it came from directly above where I was standing. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to listen more carefully. The wind outside was still extremely strong, so it still seemed reasonable to think a branch was striking the roof. I grabbed a small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked to the back door to look through the window. The rain was falling so heavily that I could barely make out the backyard. The outdoor lights had gone out along with several utility poles on the road, and all I could see were the trees thrashing violently in the wind. I went back to the living room, trying to forget about it. As soon as I sat down on the couch, I heard another thud, a single sharp knock. A few seconds later, another one. These weren't random noises caused by the storm. There was an almost regular interval between them. I stood up again and walked toward the hallway. As soon as I started moving, the knocks seemed to change position as well. Now they sounded like they were coming from the section of the roof directly above the hallway. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I waited a few moments in complete silence, nothing. I took 2 more steps. Another thud, then another. An immediate feeling of unease settled over me, but I kept trying to find a logical explanation. I thought perhaps the wind was swinging a long branch that was scraping different parts of the roof. I decided to test that theory. I slowly walked to the bedroom, then back to the living room, and finally into the kitchen. Every single time, the same thing happened. The knocks never stayed in one fixed part of the house. They seemed to follow exactly where I was. If I stopped in the kitchen, the sounds came from the section of roof above the kitchen. When I walked into the living room, a few seconds later, the knocks shifted to the roof above the living room. My heart started racing because it simply didn't match the behavior of a tree branch being blown by the wind. I picked up my phone to call my husband, but before the call could connect, the entire house lost power. The television shut off, the router went dark, and the only sounds left were the rain and the wind. The house was plunged into complete darkness. I switched on my flashlight immediately. At that moment, the knocking stopped for a few seconds. I thought it had finally ended. Then I heard 3 slow knocks directly above me. They were so close that a fine layer of dust drifted down from the ceiling onto the hardwood floor. I stood perfectly still, gripping the flashlight so tightly that my hand began to shake. I remained frozen, trying to decide what to do. My first thought was to leave the house and wait inside my car, but the storm was so intense that I could barely see the front porch through the front window. Besides, my car was parked beside the back of the house where there was almost no lighting. I considered calling the police on my cell phone, but the signal had disappeared along with the power outage. I slowly walked into the living room, hoping to find a spot where my phone might reconnect. The knocking started again immediately. One, then another, always directly above wherever I happened to be. They weren't footsteps running or someone walking normally. They sounded like small, spaced-out impacts, as though someone were carefully shifting their body weight across the roof. The harder I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became that someone was directly above me. At one point, I even switched off my flashlight for a few seconds just to listen more carefully. The rain was loud, but the knocks remained distinct. Every time I moved into another room a few seconds later, they shifted position as well. At that moment, I stopped looking for explanations involving the wind. For the first time, I seriously considered that someone might actually be on top of the house. I waited for my phone signal to return while staring at the screen illuminated by my flashlight. A few minutes later, the power suddenly came back. The kitchen lights flickered on for a moment, the television rebooted, and the router began reconnecting. I immediately ran for the landline in the living room, but before I could dial, I heard the electronic doorbell system restarting. I remembered that the house had a camera installed at the front door and another on the back porch, both accessible through an app that was already connected to the home's Wi-Fi. Almost automatically, I opened the app on my phone. The front camera showed nothing but rain. Then I selected the back camera. The instant the image loaded, I saw a man slowly climbing down from the roof onto the back porch using one of the wooden support columns. He moved with incredible calm, never rushing, as though he knew exactly where to place his feet without making any noise. He was dressed entirely in dark clothing and wore a baseball cap that hid his face. Before I could zoom in or take a screenshot, the power went out again. The app switched back to offline mode, and all that remained was the frozen image of that man disappearing from the camera. My body went into full panic mode. I locked the bedroom door, ran inside, and shoved a small dresser against it, even though I knew it probably wouldn't stop anyone from getting in. I tried calling 911 several times while pacing near the window where a single bar of signal occasionally appeared. After several attempts, the call finally connected. I spoke as quietly as I could, explaining that I had seen a man climbing down from the roof and believed he was still outside the house. The dispatcher instructed me to stay inside a locked room until the police arrived. The next 15 or 20 minutes felt much longer. The knocking on the roof never returned, but I heard a faint creak coming from the back porch, followed by the sound of a doorknob being turned once. Then everything became completely silent. When the flashing lights of the patrol cars finally reflected through the windows, I felt a sense of relief I'll never forget. I waited until an officer knocked and identified himself before opening the door. The officers searched the entire house, the porch, the roof, and the surrounding property. They didn't find anyone. Behind the house, however, they discovered fresh boot prints in the mud leading toward the woods behind the property. They also found an aluminum ladder leaning against the fence hidden among some bushes, and it definitely didn't belong to the owner. Unfortunately, because the power failed immediately after I saw the camera footage, the recording of that moment became corrupted and couldn't be recovered. The homeowner replaced the entire camera system and upgraded the exterior lighting just a few days later. To this day, I still wonder how long that man had been on the roof before I noticed the knocking. What frightens me the most is remembering that the sounds seemed to follow my movements throughout the house, as though he had been watching me through the windows and silently walking above me the entire time. Ever since that night, whenever I'm alone in a house during a storm, any sound coming from the roof is enough to keep me awake. Story 6. My name is Oliver, I'm 24 years old, and I grew up in a small town in rural Indiana. My parents own a medium-sized farm where they raise cattle and grow corn. And ever since I was a teenager, I helped with just about everything whenever I wasn't working another job. The week this happened, my parents had traveled to visit my grandmother after she underwent surgery, and I was left in charge of the property for 2 days. It wasn't the first time I'd done it. I knew every fence, every barn, and every piece of equipment on the farm. That night, however, a storm front had been moving through the area since late afternoon. The wind grew stronger with every passing hour, and around 9 o'clock that night, the power went out across the entire property. Fortunately, we had a generator installed next to the main barn to keep some essential equipment running. A few minutes after the power outage, I noticed the generator had also shut down. I figured it was probably just a simple problem caused by the rain, so I grabbed a flashlight, put on a rain jacket, and went outside to check it before things got any worse. The walk between the house and the barn was just over 100 yards, but in that storm it felt much longer. Rain hammered against the hood of my raincoat, and the mud swallowed my boots with every step. The only light came from my flashlight and the flashes of lightning that illuminated the entire farm for a few seconds, before everything fell back into darkness. When I reached the generator, I confirmed that it had indeed shut off. I opened the side panel and began checking the breakers and the fuel level. While I was doing that, I heard a metallic creak directly behind me. I pointed my flashlight toward the barn. The main door was standing completely open. That caught my attention immediately because I'd been there less than an hour earlier to check on the animals, and I clearly remembered closing both doors because of the rain and the wind. I thought maybe a strong gust had blown them open. I was about to walk over when a loud clap of thunder drowned out every other sound. As soon as it faded, I heard a whistle coming from inside the barn. It was soft, slow, and steady, like someone patiently waiting for another person to come closer. I stood completely still, trying to convince myself that the sound could have come from somewhere along the road, or even from the wind passing through a crack. I waited several seconds without moving. The whistling stopped. I kept staring into the dark entrance of the barn, illuminating only part of the interior with my flashlight. I didn't see anyone. I thought maybe one of the animals had gotten loose and knocked something over inside. That had happened before when one of the calves managed to push through a divider. I walked toward the door, calling for the farm dogs, thinking one of them might have gone inside to get out of the rain. None of them appeared. The smell of damp hay and wet wood grew stronger the moment I stepped inside. Water dripped from my coat, forming small puddles on the concrete floor. The barn was almost completely dark because the generator was still off. I slowly swept my flashlight across the first aisles, the stalls, and the tool storage area. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it a few hours earlier. I even took a step backward, thinking I should return to the generator and finish the repair before looking around more carefully. That's when I heard the same whistle again. This time it clearly came from deeper inside the barn, several yards ahead of me. I followed the sound with my flashlight pointed straight ahead. The whistling stopped again before I could determine where it had come from. My heart was already racing, but I still tried to come up with a logical explanation. I thought maybe someone from the area had come inside to take shelter from the storm. I continued walking slowly between stacks of hay bales piled nearly to the ceiling. The rain hammered so loudly against the metal roof that it was difficult to hear anything else. Then a bolt of lightning lit up the entire interior, through the cracks in the walls for a split second. In that flash, I clearly saw a man crouching behind one of the haystacks, staring directly at me. He was perfectly still and partially hidden, as if he were trying not to be seen. As soon as darkness returned, I instinctively took a step backward. I raised my flashlight toward where he had been, but I couldn't see anyone. Before I could react, I heard another creak coming from the entrance to the barn. I spun around and pointed the flashlight toward the door. Another man was standing directly in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He simply remained there, silently blocking the only way out. For several seconds, no one moved at all. I kept my flashlight aimed at the man in the doorway while trying to keep the other one within my field of vision. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. I thought about asking who they were, but one look at the situation told me there was nothing normal about it. If they were neighbors looking for shelter from the storm, why was one hiding behind the hay bales while the other stood directly in the only exit? Even so, I asked, my voice trembling, what they wanted. Neither of them answered. The man at the doorway simply took one step farther into the barn. At that moment, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me, like someone dragging a boot across the concrete. The hidden man had changed positions. Without waiting another second, I ran toward the opposite side of the barn, weaving between two stacks of hay bales. I'd known that barn since I was a kid and remembered there was a small side door used to move smaller equipment. As I ran, I heard footsteps behind me for the first time. They weren't yelling or charging after me in a panic. They were simply following me in silence. I reached the side door and tried turning the handle. It wouldn't open. I immediately remembered that my dad always kept it locked from the inside at night to prevent tool theft. My heart pounded even harder. I turned my flashlight behind me and saw one of the men emerging between the rows of hay bales. He continued walking slowly without saying a single word. At that exact moment, another bolt of lightning illuminated the entire barn. That's when I noticed a wooden ladder leaning against one wall, leading up to the hayloft above. I practically climbed it 2 steps at a time. I heard both men quicken their pace right behind me. As soon as I reached the loft, I ran across the wooden planks toward a small ventilation window. It overlooked the back of the barn, where there was a pile of sand used for small construction projects around the farm. Without thinking, I shoved the window open with my shoulder, managed to force it wide enough, and jumped. The landing injured my ankle, but I got back to my feet immediately and ran toward the house, dropping my flashlight somewhere along the way. I ran as fast as I could, despite the sharp pain shooting through my ankle every time my boots hit the mud. I didn't look back for almost the entire run. Only when I was close to the front porch did I dare glance over my shoulder for a second. As another flash of lightning lit up the property, I saw 2 silhouettes slowly stepping out of the barn. They didn't chase me. They simply stood near the doorway, staring toward the house. I rushed inside, locked every door, and turned off the few lights that were still working, thanks to a small backup battery. My cell phone had enough signal to complete a call to 911. I explained that 2 unknown people had entered the farm and were still on the property. While waiting for the police to arrive, I stayed away from the windows, watching only through a small gap in the curtains. At one point, I saw the headlights of a pickup truck switch on near the access road. The 2 men calmly walked toward it and drove away before any patrol car arrived. The police searched the entire farm that night. They found fresh footprints in the mud near the barn and tire tracks that didn't belong to my vehicle or any of the farm's trucks. They also discovered that someone had cut the padlock off a smaller storage building behind the barn, although nothing had been stolen. One of the officers commented that groups specializing in stealing tractors, tools, and agricultural equipment often watched isolated farms during storms because they knew the sound of the rain covered almost every other noise. They believed those men probably hadn't expected to find anyone on the property that night. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had kept working on the generator for just a few more minutes before noticing the open barn door. I also wonder why one of them started whistling. Maybe it was to draw my attention into the barn. Maybe it was to make sure I walked inside on my own. I'll never know. What I do know is that ever since that night, whenever I have to check equipment outside during a storm, the very first thing I do is carefully look all around me before taking another step.
I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.